Ethan had always been drawn to the old mansion at the edge of town. It stood on a hill, its windows like hollow eyes watching the town below. The house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, its once grand exterior now crumbling and weathered. But to Ethan, it was more than just a relic of the past. It was part of his family's history. Growing up, he had heard whispers about the house, about the strange occurrences that had plagued his ancestors, about the dark secrets it held. His parents never spoke of it, but the stories had a way of lingering in the corners of his mind. The mansion was cursed, they said, a place where no one dared go, a place where bad things happened. But when Ethan's father passed away unexpectedly, he found himself inheriting the old family home. No one else in the family wanted it. They all believed the curse was real, but Ethan had always been skeptical of such things. He was a man of logic, of science. He didn't believe in curses or ghosts. The house, to him, was just a building, a place to start over. He decided to visit the mansion for the first time since his childhood, to inspect the property and see what remained. The road leading up to it was overgrown, the trees thick and twisted, blocking out the sun. Ethan's car creaked as he drove up, the engine sputtering slightly, as if even the car could sense the weight of the place ahead. The house loomed before him as he parked. Its front door was ajar, the wooden frame warped from years of neglect. A gust of wind rattled the loose shutters, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. He took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he wandered through the grand hallway. Faded portraits of stern-looking men and women stared down at him from the walls, their eyes seemingly following his every move. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the remnants of a life long forgotten. As he explored, Ethan's mind kept drifting back to the stories he'd heard. He had been told that his ancestors had made a terrible mistake, one that had doomed the family for generations. But what exactly that mistake was, no one ever spoke of. All he knew was that the curse was real, and it had been passed down like a dark inheritance. It wasn't until he reached the basement that he began to feel a strange unease. The stairs creaked under his weight as he descended into the darkness. The air down here was damp and cold, and the walls were lined with old wooden shelves filled with dusty bottles and jars. But what caught his attention wasn't the shelves. It was a large, old chest in the corner of the room, partially hidden beneath a pile of forgotten items. Curiosity gnawed at him as he approached it. The chest was locked, the iron lock rusted and worn. Ethan knelt down and examined it, his fingers brushing over the strange symbols carved into the surface. Symbols that seemed familiar, as though he had seen them somewhere before. He felt an unsettling chill run up his spine, but he shook it off. It was just an old chest, nothing more. With a grunt, he pried open the lock and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, he found a collection of old papers, faded photographs, and a small, ornate box. The box was unlike anything he had ever seen. Made of dark wood, intricately carved with the same symbols as the chest. It felt heavy in his hands, and as he held it, a strange sensation washed over him, like something was calling to him from within. He opened the box slowly, his heart racing. Inside was a single object, a small, withered key. It looked insignificant, almost laughable. But as he held it in his palm, he felt a sudden compulsion to turn it over in his fingers, as though it held the answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask. A soft whisper echoed in the room. Ethan froze. He thought he had imagined it, but then it came again, a voice barely audible, like a breath carried on the wind. "You shouldn't have opened it." His breath caught in his throat, and his eyes darted around the dark room. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, swirling in the air around him. His pulse quickened, his hands trembling. The key fell from his grasp and clattered to the floor, the noise loud in the silence that followed. "Who's there?" he demanded, but no one answered. Suddenly, the room felt colder, darker. He could see his breath misting in the air as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. His eyes widened as he scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. He needed to leave, but the key, the box, the whispers, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected to something much bigger than him. Something he wasn't ready to face. He turned to leave, but before he could reach the stairs, a loud crash echoed through the basement. His heart leapt into his throat as the room seemed to pulse with energy. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were alive, closing in on him. He spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The basement door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispers grew louder. "It's too late." Ethan stumbled backward, his hands bracing against the walls for support. The shadows seemed to come alive, moving closer, and he felt an icy coldness settle over him. There was no escape. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything except the cold air that seemed to press in from every corner. He could barely breathe, the oppressive atmosphere of the basement suffocating him. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. But there was nothing except the whispers that continued to echo through his mind. "It's too late." The voice seemed to come from everywhere, seeping into his thoughts like poison. Ethan's heart raced, the key on the floor now forgotten, as his mind raced to make sense of what was happening. The air was frigid now, and Ethan's breath came out in white clouds. His fingers tingled with a strange, cold sensation. The walls of the basement seemed to close in around him, and the shadows in the corners grew darker, twisting into unnatural shapes. "You shouldn't have opened it." The words were clearer now, and they sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. His hand shot out, grasping the railing of the basement stairs. He had to get out. The suffocating weight of the room was unbearable. With his heart pounding in his chest, he turned, desperate to escape. But the stairs, they weren't the same. Ethan froze. The stairs had never seemed this steep. The wood creaked unnaturally under his weight, as if the house itself were alive, trying to drag him back. He forced his legs to move, taking slow, cautious steps up, but each one seemed to pull him deeper into the basement's grip. With every step, the whispers grew louder. "It's never over. It's never over." The sound of his own heartbeat drowned out everything else, until the whispers were nothing more than a distant hum, barely audible but still present. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he grasped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, once so easy to open, now felt as if it were locked, refusing to let him out. Panicking, Ethan pulled harder, his muscles straining, but the door wouldn't move. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cold, and his throat tightened with fear. And then there was a sound, a soft scraping coming from behind him. Ethan's blood ran cold. He dared not look over his shoulder, afraid of what he might see. The shadows in the corners were no longer just shadows. They had shape, movement, something inhuman. The scraping grew louder, closer, until it sounded like fingernails dragging across the floor. Ethan's breathing became shallow, his chest tight as the cold pressed against him, the weight of the house pressing in. He could feel it, an oppressive force that wanted him to stay, to never leave. The curse had found him. His thoughts raced. He had to leave. He had to escape. In a fit of desperation, he turned, throwing himself at the door once more. His shoulder collided with the wood, and this time, the door opened. He stumbled forward, gasping for breath, into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet now. The whispers had stopped, and the oppressive feeling that had filled the basement seemed to follow him into the house. He ran up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty silence. But something felt wrong. He reached the main floor, where the grand portrait still hung, their eyes following his every move. The house seemed colder than it had been before, the air thick with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He needed answers, but what was the curse? What had he uncovered? He needed to know. His gaze fell upon the ornate box he had found in the basement. He had dropped it in the panic of his escape, but now it lay on the floor before him, as if it had been waiting. Ethan felt the pull again, the compulsion to open it. His hand shook as he reached for the box, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the dark wood. And then, a flash of memory struck him. A memory from when he was a child, of his mother warning him never to go near the mansion, of his father's whispered words in the dead of night. If you ever uncover the secret, the curse will come for you. The words were vivid now, and Ethan realized with a sickening certainty that he had already uncovered too much. The key, the box, the whispers, it was all connected. He opened the box again, his heart racing, and inside was the key, the same cold, metallic object. He picked it up, feeling the strange weight of it in his hand. A cold gust of wind blew through the house, and Ethan shuddered, the temperature dropping sharply. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across the walls, as if they were alive, and suddenly Ethan heard a sound, soft, distant. Footsteps. He turned sharply, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing there. The house was empty. Still, the footsteps continued, echoing through the halls. They grew louder, closer, until they were almost at the door. But when Ethan turned to look, the hallway was still silent. He backed away, the key still in his hand. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he realized the footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside the house. "It's coming for you," the whispers seemed to say, their voices like a chorus, chanting the same words over and over again. The house was alive, its walls groaning, its floors trembling as if something were stirring within. Ethan's fingers tightened around the key. What had he awakened? What had he unleashed? He had to find answers, but as he turned to leave the room, the door slammed shut behind him. Ethan's breath hitched as he stared at the door, his hand still gripping the cold, metal key. It was as if the house itself had decided to trap him. The silence was suffocating, but the heavy, eerie pressure of something unseen pressing in on him made it impossible to move. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, twisting and curling like dark fingers reaching out for him. He felt a chill run down his spine, the temperature in the room dropping rapidly. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. It wasn't just the air. It felt as though something ancient was stirring, waking from a long slumber. "It's too late," the whisper came again, this time clearer than before, a cold voice that seemed to seep into his very bones. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but it was impossible to ignore the fear clawing at his chest. He wasn't alone. The house was not empty. His gaze flickered to the key again. It felt heavier now, as though it were alive in his hand, pulsing with a strange, dark energy. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like the key was beckoning him, pulling him toward something. He had to get out. He had to escape before whatever was in this house consumed him too. He reached for the door, his hand shaking as he tried the handle once more, but it was useless. The door wouldn't budge. Panic started to rise in him, a tight knot in his throat as he tugged harder, but the wood remained unyielding. His mind raced for a way out, but it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep inside the house, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. Ethan froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He recognized that sound. It was the same scraping noise he had heard in the basement, that same chilling, unnatural movement. And then the footsteps began again. Soft, slow, and deliberate. They were coming from the hallway just outside the room. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt as if they were made of stone. The footsteps grew louder, closer. It was as though whoever or whatever was walking toward him was taking their time, enjoying the fear it caused. His eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any way out. The windows were sealed shut, and the walls were bare except for a large, ornate mirror that hung opposite the door. He glanced into it, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, but the mirror was empty. Yet something didn't feel right. The reflection in the mirror seemed off. The edges of his reflection were blurred, distorted, as if the glass itself was struggling to show him the truth. Ethan blinked, feeling his pulse quicken. He took a hesitant step back, his feet crunching against the dust on the floor. The footsteps stopped. There was silence again, but this silence was worse than any noise. It felt like the calm before a storm, a heavy stillness that pressed down on him from every side. He dared not move, but his instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the house before it swallowed him whole. He didn't belong here. No one did. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder this time, echoing in his ears. "You should have never come back." The words felt like a weight pressing on his chest, making it harder to breathe. The air around him grew colder still, and his vision blurred. He rubbed his eyes, trying to focus, but everything seemed to swirl around him in a haze. The walls closed in further, and the air was thick with something foul. Ethan could feel the presence now, not just in the house, but within the very walls, the floors, the air. Something was there, watching him, waiting, and then, from the farthest corner of the room, something began to move. Ethan's heart raced as he watched, transfixed by the shadow that seemed to crawl along the floor, a dark, writhing shape that inched closer and closer toward him. The scraping sound grew louder, and with it, a deep, guttural growl that made his skin crawl. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow seemed to split, stretching in unnatural directions. It was as if the very darkness in the room was alive, hungry. The growl grew louder, a low, vibrating hum that rattled his bones. And then, just as quickly as it began, everything stopped. Silence. It was worse than the noise. Ethan couldn't move, his body frozen in place. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then he heard it. A low chuckle, soft and sickening. He spun around, eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound, but the room was empty. The mirror's reflection now seemed to shimmer, the surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. His breath came out in sharp, shallow gasps. He couldn't explain it, but the room felt wrong. Everything in it seemed distorted, like the world was bending and twisting around him. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, taking on unnatural shapes. The laughter came again, louder now, clearer. Ethan spun to face the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. But there was something different about it. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something else, something moving behind him. He tried to move, to escape, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, trapped. The figure in the reflection moved, and for the first time, Ethan saw it. A shadow, tall and indistinct, lurking just behind him. It was a silhouette, but its features were indistinguishable. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The shadow in the mirror raised its hand. Long, skeletal fingers reaching for him, inching closer until a loud crash came from behind him. Ethan spun around, the mirror's reflection warping as he did. The room was now filled with darkness, thick and heavy. He had to get out. He had to leave. But the door, it was still shut, the handle cold and unmoving. And the shadow? It wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was right behind him. The air around Ethan felt thicker now, pressing in on him with every breath. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence that filled the room. The shadow behind him wasn't just a trick of the light anymore. It was real. It was there, inches from his back, and he could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. He turned slowly, his body trembling, as if every nerve in his body was screaming at him to run, to get away from whatever was standing behind him. But when he looked, the shadow was gone. There was nothing but the dim light from the cracked window, the dust swirling in the stale air. Ethan's hands were clammy, his mind racing. Was it his imagination, or had he really seen something? He wasn't sure anymore. The house was playing tricks on him, twisting reality with every passing second. His legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath him at any moment. But he had to keep moving. He had to find a way out before whatever had awakened in this house found him. The key in his hand seemed heavier now, the metal cold against his palm. He looked at it, wondering if it held the answer, if it could unlock the door to his escape. But the more he stared at it, the more he felt that there was something off about it. The key wasn't just a key. It was a symbol, a piece of the curse that had been buried in his family's history. He thought back to the letter, the one his grandmother had left for him. Her warning had been clear. The curse is real. The house remembers. You cannot escape it. The key binds you. The words echoed in his mind as he turned the key in the lock once more. This time, the door opened with a creak, the sound unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Ethan stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet as if the house itself was groaning in protest. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and narrow, the walls lined with old portraits that seemed to watch him as he passed. A cold draft swept through the house, tugging at his clothes, whispering in his ear like an old friend trying to tell him something. He shivered, his breath fogging in the cold air. Every step he took felt like it was leading him deeper into the heart of the house, deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway swung open on its own, the hinges groaning as if they hadn't moved in years. Ethan's eyes widened. He hadn't seen anyone else in the house, but now he wasn't so sure. Someone or something was here with him. He hesitated, his body frozen in place. Every instinct told him to turn around and leave, but he couldn't. He had to know what was behind that door. He had to understand what was happening, why the curse had come for him. With a deep breath, he walked toward the door, his feet heavy, each step sounding louder than the last. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached, and a sense of dread settled over him like a weight. He reached the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was small and dimly lit by a single, flickering candle. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty books, and a large wooden desk stood against the far wall. But it wasn't the books or the desk that caught Ethan's attention. It was the mirror. It hung on the far wall just like the one in the hallway, but this one was different. It was larger, its surface dark and murky, as if something was trapped inside. Ethan felt drawn to it, unable to look away. He took a step closer, his reflection staring back at him, but something was wrong. His reflection wasn't still like it should have been. It moved, jerking and twitching as though it were alive. His heart raced. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. A sudden chill shot through him, and the reflection in the mirror twisted, changing. His own face seemed to contort into something monstrous, a grotesque version of himself, grinning back at him with eyes that weren't his own. Ethan stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. He turned quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on him. He could hear the sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, echoing in the hallway. He wasn't alone. The whispering returned, faint at first, but growing louder, more urgent. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were like a razor scraping against his mind, a cold, familiar voice that sent shivers down his spine. Ethan spun around, but there was no one there. The door to the room slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The house was alive. Ethan's breath came in quick gasps as he stumbled toward the desk, his eyes scanning the room for any way out. His gaze fell on a piece of paper, yellowed with age, resting on the desk. He picked it up, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. The letter was written in a handwriting he didn't recognize, but the words were unmistakable. "The curse cannot be broken. It lives in the blood. The house is its vessel. You must leave before it takes you. The key is your bond. Once the curse is unleashed, there is no escape." Ethan's heart sank. This was it. This was what his grandmother had warned him about. The curse wasn't just a family legend, it was real, and it was coming for him. Suddenly, the room grew darker, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching for him. The air thickened, and the temperature dropped. Ethan could feel the walls closing in around him, suffocating him. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. "It's too late." He turned and ran to the door, his hand desperately twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. He was trapped. The walls were alive, and the curse was closing in. He could feel it now, crawling under his skin, seeping into his very soul. And then he heard it, a soft, slow creaking from behind him. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror. The mirror was moving. The reflection of himself was no longer distorted. It was clear, and it was smiling. Ethan froze, his pulse racing as he stared at the mirror. His reflection, the one that had twisted into a grotesque grin moments ago, was now calm. Too calm. His reflection stood still, staring back at him with eyes that were no longer his own. It wasn't just the reflection that frightened him. It was the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just behind him. The air in the room grew thick, and a strange, almost oppressive weight pressed down on him, as though the house itself was alive, feeding off his fear. Ethan backed away from the mirror, his breath shallow. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the glass. It felt as if the mirror had some kind of pull, something drawing him in, making it impossible to look away. He had to get out of this room. He had to find a way to escape. But no matter how much he tried to turn, his body wouldn't obey. His legs were rooted to the floor, his feet unwilling to move. The whispers, those faint voices he had been hearing, grew louder. They sounded like murmurs, just beyond his hearing. But there was a harshness to them now, a sense of urgency. "You can't leave. Not until it's done." The words weren't just in his ears, they were in his mind. They swirled around, digging into his thoughts, twisting his reality. Ethan felt like he was drowning in them, as if he could no longer distinguish his own thoughts from the voices that seemed to whisper from every corner of the room. He turned again, eyes wide with panic, but the mirror, the reflection was still there, standing, smiling, and then it moved. The reflection in the mirror stepped forward, its movement unnatural, jerky. It mirrored every motion Ethan made, but not in sync. Its steps were out of time, as if it were trying to escape the glass. And as it moved closer, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Get away from it," he shouted at himself, his voice trembling. The reflection smirked in reply. The smile was too wide, stretching beyond the limits of what should have been possible. It was like watching something wrong. Ethan's chest tightened. Something inside him screamed to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The whispering voices had now become clear, sharp, insistent. "You're part of it now." Ethan's heart pounded louder than the whispers, his thoughts racing in a chaotic frenzy. He grabbed for the door handle once again, but it remained locked, stubbornly, cruelly locked. His fingers trembled as they gripped the key. He didn't understand it. He didn't know how it had all started, how the curse had come for him. But it was happening. He was part of it. The key had bound him to this house, to this nightmare. The reflection in the mirror was getting closer, inch by inch. It was now so close that Ethan could hear its breathing, shallow and heavy, as if it were struggling to break free. Then, as if something inside the glass snapped, the reflection reached out with its hand, fingers pressed against the glass. And in the blink of an eye, it was no longer a reflection. The figure in the mirror had stepped out, and now it stood before him, grinning that same twisted grin, its eyes black and empty. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body paralyzed with fear. The figure before him wasn't human. It wasn't just a shadow or a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was coming for him. "You belong here now," it whispered, its voice like nails scraping against stone. Ethan tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, trapped by the crushing weight of fear. His mind was racing, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing, no escape. He was trapped in this house, in this nightmare, and the curse had found him. Suddenly, the floor beneath his feet creaked, and the walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. The temperature in the room dropped, and Ethan could see his breath in the air, misting before him like a cloud of terror. His skin prickled with cold as the figure moved closer. "It's too late," the thing in front of him whispered. Its voice was a soft hiss, a cruel reminder of what he had become. The curse had already started to take root, and there was no way out now. The mirror, the reflection, had all been a warning he hadn't understood until it was too late. The figure reached out toward him, its fingers long and thin, ending in sharp, claw-like nails. Ethan felt a cold hand brush against his arm, and the touch sent a jolt of ice through his veins. His heart skipped a beat, and in that moment he knew it was over. But then, as if something in him snapped, he managed to take a step back. He wasn't sure how, but something inside him fought back. A voice, his voice, screamed at him to fight, to break free. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and ran. The house seemed to shift around him. The walls stretched, the hallway twisted, and the door he had come through seemed to grow further away with each step. He ran, his feet stumbling over the old wooden floors. His mind was a blur of fear, desperation, and confusion. The whispers chased him, growing louder and louder, echoing in his ears, until they became a deafening roar. "You cannot escape," the words repeated over and over, getting louder with every step he took. He slammed into a wall, his breath ragged, his vision blurry with panic. He spun around, looking for an exit, but there was nothing. Only the suffocating shadows and the oppressive silence of the house. Then, a voice, clear, sharp, and unmistakable, rang out in the darkness. "You've been here before." Ethan froze, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. He knew that voice. He had heard it before. But from where and when? A figure appeared in the distance. Familiar, yet not. And Ethan realized with growing horror, it wasn't just the house that had a curse. It was him too. The curse was in his blood. It had always been there, waiting to take him. Ethan's legs were trembling as he stumbled through the dark, twisting corridors of the house. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, the sharp, whispering voices in his head blurring together with the pounding of his heart. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was trying to pull him back. The air grew colder with each passing moment, thick with an unsettling silence that gnawed at his nerves. He couldn't see anything clearly, just shadows stretching across the walls, the low creaks of the old house echoing around him. His breath came out in short, panicked bursts, the mist of it swirling before him like ghosts of his fear. The whispers returned, louder now, as if they were right beside him. "You can't escape. It knows you." Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. The voice was familiar, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't the voice of the figure from the mirror. It was deeper, darker, more sinister. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. But no matter how hard he tried to steady his breathing, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind him, watching. He turned slowly, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The hall was empty, but something didn't feel right. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, shifting. The very air seemed to vibrate with a low hum. Ethan backed away, his eyes scanning the shadows, looking for any sign of movement. A chill ran down his spine when he noticed it. From the corner of his eye, he saw the faintest flicker of movement, just a shadow slipping across the floor. He whipped his head around, but again, there was nothing. Just the same empty hallway, the same suffocating silence. But the feeling was unmistakable. The feeling that something was there, just out of sight, something watching him. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door to his left slammed open with a deafening crash. Ethan jumped, his heart racing, but he was frozen, unable to move. The door creaked ominously as it swung wide, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, dim light. The light didn't seem to come from anywhere, just a cold, unnatural glow that made the air shimmer. Something called to him from within the room, not in words, but in the strange, magnetic pull of it. He didn't want to go inside, but something deep inside him was urging him forward. A voice, a whisper, command. Come closer. He didn't want to listen. He didn't want to step forward, but his feet moved anyway, as if they had a mind of their own. His body was no longer his own. It was being led by the pull of the curse, dragged toward the room, toward whatever lay beyond. As he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. The room was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It wasn't a typical room. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of him. Some with their eyes wide in terror, others smiling that twisted grin he had seen earlier. But none of the reflections were him. They were distorted, warped by something dark and malicious. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned around, eyes wide, but the door was gone. There was no exit, no way out. Only the mirrors and the whispers. You're in it now. The sound of the whispers grew louder, surrounding him, pressing in from all sides. They weren't just words anymore. They were images, memories, visions of things that didn't belong in this world. As he gazed into one of the mirrors, the image before him shifted. At first, it was just a flicker, a glimpse of something moving behind him. But as he looked closer, his heart sank. It was him. Not in the reflection, but standing behind him, its eyes hollow and black, its mouth stretched into that grotesque smile. "It's too late. You're part of it now." He spun around, but nothing was there. His breath came faster, panic rising in his chest. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were inching closer with each passing second. His body was trembling, his mind unraveling with fear. "You've already started," the voice said again, this time clearer, sharper, like a command. "There is no way out." Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The mirrors began to vibrate, their glass rippling like water. He reached out instinctively to touch the nearest one, and then everything went dark. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there. Seconds? Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to lose all meaning in the room, swallowed by the blackness. But when his vision cleared, he was no longer in the same room. He was standing in a long, dimly lit hallway. It was a hallway he recognized. No, his voice was barely a whisper. He had been here before many times, but it was always different. The walls, the doorways, they always changed, always led him in a new direction. But there was always the same feeling, the same oppressive weight hanging in the air. This wasn't a dream. He wasn't imagining this. The curse had a hold on him now. It was pulling him deeper, twisting him into something else. Something he didn't understand, and he didn't know how to stop it. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch longer, more sinister. His breath caught in his throat when he saw it. The figure at the end of the hall, standing in the shadows. The same figure he had seen in the reflection. The one with the black eyes, the twisted grin. It stepped forward, its form shifting with each movement, like it was made of smoke and darkness. "You're mine now," it said, its voice cold and empty. The whisper echoed in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. Ethan tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The air was thick, suffocating, and the figure, it was getting closer, its movement slow, deliberate. Ethan's heart raced. There was nowhere to go. And then, everything went silent. Ethan's heart pounded as the shadowy figure took another step toward him, its eyes hollow and cold, its grin stretching wider with every inch it moved. The air around him grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the darkness itself was pressing in on him. He couldn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor, and the weight in his chest made it hard to breathe. "You're too late," the voice echoed again, now like a growl, reverberating through the walls. He wanted to scream. He wanted to fight, but no sound came from his mouth. The words were caught in his throat, trapped like the rest of him. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence heavy and cold. It looked at him with those empty, soulless eyes, the grin still growing impossibly wide. Ethan could feel his sanity slipping away, each second spent in its presence drawing him further into the abyss. "It's all been leading to this," the figure said, its voice more familiar now, a twisted mockery of the whispers that had tormented him for so long. The curse, the house, the mirrors. They were all just pieces of the puzzle. Ethan's mind raced, but nothing made sense. The house, the strange things he had seen, was it all part of this? Was it all tied to the curse? He didn't understand, but he couldn't let this figure win. He had to break free. He had to escape. "You can't escape," the figure hissed. "You're already part of it. Just like the others." The words echoed in his ears, repeating over and over. He could feel the presence of something dark, something ancient, closing in around him. The house itself seemed to respond, its walls groaning under some unseen weight, the floors shifting beneath his feet as if the entire place was alive, breathing with him, suffocating him. Suddenly, the figure's grin twisted into something even darker. It raised one hand, long, bony fingers stretching out toward him. Ethan stumbled back, but his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped. The figure's hand reached for his chest, and Ethan's vision blurred. He could feel a cold, searing pain as the figure's touch connected with his skin. It was like ice running through his veins, pulling him into something deep, something that felt as though it had no end. The world around him began to fade, the edges of the room melting away into darkness. The figure's voice was the last thing he heard before everything went black. "Welcome to your fate," the figure whispered, its voice like a distant, fading memory. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in the house. He was standing in a dark forest, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the scene. He tried to move, but his legs felt unsteady. The pain in his chest was gone, but the weight of the curse still pressed down on him. He could feel it, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to claim him fully. There was no sign of the figure, but he knew it was there. He could feel its presence in the air, its eyes watching him from the shadows. The whispers returned, softer this time, like a lullaby that promised nothing but fear. "You can't run from it." Ethan turned, his heart racing, his body moving on its own as if it knew the way. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around him, blocking out the little light that had been left. He stumbled forward, his breath ragged, but something in his chest told him he couldn't stop. In the distance, he saw a faint light flickering, like a lantern, swaying gently in the wind. It seemed like an answer, a way out. He pushed himself to move faster, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter. He could make out the shape of an old house in the distance. It looked like the one he had been in, but different, more faded, like it had been forgotten by time itself. Ethan's mind raced. Was this the house from his memories? Or was it another illusion? Another piece of the curse meant to trap him forever? "It's all the same," the whispers said, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "No matter where you go, it's all part of it." The light seemed to grow even brighter now, the warmth of it beckoning him closer. He felt himself moving, his legs carrying him toward the door, his hands reaching for the handle. But before he could touch it, the door slammed open on its own. A figure stood in the doorway, bathed in a soft, golden light. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the face. It was his mother. Her face was kind, her eyes filled with the love and warmth he had once known. She smiled at him, her hands outstretched toward him. "Come home, Ethan," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. Ethan froze. He could feel tears stinging at the corners of his eyes. His mother. He hadn't seen her in years, not since she died. Was this real? Was she really here? But then, the smile faded. The warmth in her eyes turned cold, the light flickering and dimming around her. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice distorted, turning into something darker. "This is where it ends. This is where it begins." Suddenly, the light went out, and the figure of his mother disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan standing alone in the dark forest. The whispers grew louder again, a cacophony of voices in his mind. "It's already too late." Ethan's heart sank. The darkness around him was closing in once more, the weight of the curse heavier than ever. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, no matter how hard he tried, it would follow him. It would claim him. And then he heard the voice again. "You're not alone." Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the dark forest, the shadows closing in around him like a thick fog. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight from the crushing weight of fear and confusion. The whispers were louder now, filling his mind with a maddening chorus of voices. They spoke of the curse, of the dark force that had haunted his family for generations, and of the price he would have to pay. "You can't escape it," the voices whispered, over and over. "It's in your blood. It's in your soul." Ethan's thoughts were a blur. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. The house, his family's secret, the mirror, nothing made sense anymore. Was it all real, or was he losing his mind? The dark figure, the twisted version of his mother. It all felt like a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. His legs trembled, and he took a step backward, only to find himself stumbling into something cold and wet. He turned, his heart pounding in his chest, and found himself face to face with the mirror. The same mirror from the house, the one that had shown him the horrors of his past, the one that had trapped him in this nightmare. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was the figure, the dark, shadowy presence that had been haunting him since the moment he stepped foot in the cursed house. Its hollow eyes stared back at him from the glass, its grin twisted and cruel. The figure reached out, its fingers pressing against the surface of the mirror as if trying to reach through to him. Ethan recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. He knew what he had to do. The curse had to end. He had to break free. "You cannot break it," the voice of the figure echoed from the mirror, a low, mocking laugh following the words. "You belong to it now." Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could help him. He couldn't let this nightmare claim him. He couldn't let the curse continue to haunt him and his family. His gaze fell on the ground, where a strange old book lay half-buried in the dirt. The pages were tattered, the cover worn and faded with age. He reached down, his fingers trembling, and pulled it free. The book felt heavy in his hands, its presence unsettling, but he couldn't stop now. There was no time to question it. Opening the book, Ethan found it filled with strange symbols and words he didn't understand. But as he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. There, written in the center of the page, was a single line. "To break the curse, you must face the darkness within." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what it meant, but it had to be the answer. The curse, the evil that had plagued his family for so long, was tied to something inside him. Something dark, something he couldn't run from. He took a deep breath and turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its fingers pressed against the glass, its grin widening with every passing second. But Ethan didn't back away this time. He stepped forward, his hands shaking as he held the book in front of him. "I will face it," Ethan whispered to himself, more as a promise than a declaration. He didn't know if he could do it, but he had no choice. The curse had already taken so much from him, and he wasn't about to let it take any more. The figure in the mirror laughed, the sound echoing in the darkness. "You think you can defeat me?" it sneered. "You think you can face the darkness within?" Ethan didn't answer. He closed his eyes, holding the book tightly to his chest. He focused on the words he had read, on the idea that the curse could be broken. He reached into himself, into the very depths of his soul, searching for the darkness that had been hiding there, waiting for him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a cold wind blowing through his heart, the darkness began to rise. It wasn't something physical, but a feeling, a presence that had been buried deep within him. The curse had always been a part of him, something he had inherited, something that had grown stronger with each generation. As the darkness grew, Ethan felt his mind begin to unravel. The whispers in his ears became louder, more frantic, urging him to give in, to let the curse consume him. But he refused. He had to face it. He had to break free. With every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan opened his eyes and faced the mirror once more. The figure's grin had faded, replaced with an expression of rage. It reached out toward him, its form twisting and distorting, but Ethan stood his ground. "I will not be your prisoner," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silent forest. The figure howled in fury, its form contorting as if it were being torn apart. The darkness surrounding Ethan swirled, trying to pull him in, but he pushed back. With the strength of his will, he faced the dark force within himself and refused to let it control him any longer. "I choose freedom," he said, the words steady and firm. The moment the words left his mouth, the darkness recoiled, like a shadow retreating from the light. The figure in the mirror screeched, its image shattering into 1,000 pieces. The forest around Ethan trembled, the air growing lighter, the oppressive weight lifting from his chest. As the pieces of the mirror faded into nothingness, Ethan felt the curse break. The darkness that had haunted him, that had been passed down through generations, was gone. He had faced it, and he had won. The forest began to fade, too. The trees, the cold, the shadows, they all disappeared as the world around him shifted. Ethan found himself standing back in his own house, the morning light creeping through the windows, casting a warm glow on the room. It was over. He had faced the darkness. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was free.